Hey, how's it going, everybody? So we're live with a lot of folks from Harmonix over the years, and we're going to be talking about the history of the studio and its arc following the release of Guitar Hero and through a lot of the boom and bust cycle in the music genre. Obviously, one of the reasons we're doing this today, if you haven't followed the website today, we published a very long oral history of the making of Guitar Hero 1, written by Blake Hester. And it's, when I say it's really long, like I'm not kidding. Like, it's 30,000 words. Like, it's a small novella. And it's a big commitment, but I think it's worth it. And it's a lot of fun. So you should check it out. But because it's really comprehensive, we're going to try to avoid retreading too much of that ground here, and we're going to talk about some subjects that were tabled in that article. So here I am joined by, first of all, I'm just going to, as you appear on my screen, we are joined by Ryan Lesser. Ryan, hey, say hi. And
Hi.
What was your role with Harmonix and on Guitar Hero?
I was the art director at Harmonix from the, 99 until something like 3 years ago. And I was either art lead or creative director on different projects while there. On Guitar Hero in particular, I was the art lead and in the design cabal, or whatever we called it back then.
I should also call out the fact that Ryan was kind enough to come up with a lot of art for us, some original and also some pulled from the archives from deep within Harmonix. So Ryan, thanks a lot for making this piece look as good as it does. And thank you for being responsive to a frankly absurd request for original art, like 2 weeks before Christmas.
Yeah.
And like, I'm aware it was an odd request and was a lot of hassle, but my thanks to you and Paul as well for
no problem.
pulling that out.
No problem.
We're also joined by Helen McWilliams.
Hey.
So real quick, like, what's your background with Harmonix? What was your relationship with Guitar Hero, Rock Band, etc.?
Sure. I've been at the studio since 2004. I came in on our most famous and successful game, iToy Antigrav. And I'm the VP of Creative now. I think I've been doing this job 4 years, 3 years, something like that. Yeah. So, and then on, I came into the Guitar Hero franchise officially on Guitar Hero 2. I was the associate producer. I also did a bunch of random things on the franchise. So a lot of writing and design, and like I was like our de facto PR person at the time. Like just all sorts of random assistance, I suppose.
Game development.
Yeah, I mostly like spun around in a desk and complained about things.
Alex, now, I think most people know this, but obviously most people are going to be like, hey, it's Alex from Giant Bomb, but obviously you were at Harmonix as well. So why don't you sketch your history both at Harmonix and then what your relationship outside of being professionally employed there was before and after?
Yeah, so like before, I was just a fan, and I worked in games media. I was at GameSpot as a critic and ostensible journalist. And I was just I liked the games. I was a fan, and I liked them enough to where I met a couple of folks at the studio, including Helen, and began hassling them immediately, trying to figure out a way that I could go work there. And in 2008, I did. I moved out to Boston and worked on the PR and community team for Harmonix. And I was there until early 2010 before they announced Rock Band 3. So I was there just long enough to mess up the whole thing and ruin the genre for everyone, just leaving a smoking crater in the ground where I left. So sorry.
I do question your decision to oversaturate the genre, and telling Bobby Kotick to release more Guitar Hero and faster was maybe not optimal for Harmonix. But I respect the play, Alex. You gotta, when you see an opportunity, you gotta go for it.
Yeah, Bobby's not returning my calls much these days.
Yeah. And finally, we have Eric Brosius. Eric, welcome to the stream.
Thank you.
Now, you have a career that predates Harmonix. You sort of been all around. You were all around the Boston game development scene, and then you were one of the sort of design leads on Guitar Hero. What's your overall like CV, as it were?
My CV. I don't know what that means.
Your background before joining Harmonix,
sure,
and what your arc has been through the studio.
Sure. Thank you. Let's see. I started game development at Looking Glass Studios. I was there for maybe 6 or 7 years, something like that, until they closed. When they closed in 2000, something like that, 2001, I don't remember. And then I went to work for Irrational Games, Ken and his folks there. And then I knew people from Looking Glass and also friends of mine who came over to Harmonix, and they showed me a couple things like during frequency time and amplitude time, and I'm not sure I really got it, but then someone said, "Hey, we got a game you might like." So I was hired for Guitar Hero, and so in 2005, right as we were kind of getting going with Guitar Hero, and I was hired as the audio director, and I was the audio lead on that game, and I've been at Harmonix ever since. So all the way through.
I'm a little bit surprised that that you weren't sort of especially sought out for this, because one of the things in the piece that Blake wrote is that you're pretty serious. You're pretty serious about your music yourself, right? And
okay.
Like you sounded like somebody who's like pretty tailor-made for that project, and so I'm surprised that it was sort of that happenstance.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it was. I mean, I think I've had a long relationship with Greg, one of the other guys, who was at Harmonix forever. He's been a friend of mine for 30 years now, or something like that, and so he pulled me in and said, "I think this would be a good game for you." And at the beginning, I was kind of skeptical. I was like, I don't know, do I want to make a plastic guitar toy game? But after a while, it was the right thing for me, and got into it. Once we got it working, it was lovely. Yeah.
So one of the questions I had was, obviously Guitar Hero 1 is this runaway success, and then things start changing very quickly, both for Harmonix and then just for what this sort of burgeoning genre looks like overall. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about just like, was it a gradual change at Harmonix just in terms of the scale of operations and like what what the studio looked like, what was expected of you, or was it one of those like before and after shifts where everything just like changes in the space of a release season?
It was. I mean, it's both in certain ways, where it's like the thing I remember like most fondly is like after, first of all, like. They talk about this in the oral history, but like very few people, I would say, really thought it was going to be like a big success. So we were working on Karaoke Revolution Party at the same time as Guitar Hero. That's the title that I was working on at that time. And like that was supposed to be the like big hit game. And then we were like making this other little fun thing because we thought it was cool, but like nobody thought it would sell because it took up all the space on store shelves and it's weird. And so everybody was sort of like, oh, and then karaoke is going to be this big hit. And then it was like it did fine or whatever. But the Guitar Hero ramp was like really slow from our perspective anyway. Like people couldn't get it for a long time because stores didn't stock a lot of it at first. And it was kind of this like really gradual hit. So when we were making Guitar Hero 2, it still we weren't aware that it was like doing well anyway. And so I remember things like me being like, hey, you guys, I heard there's like this bar in Brooklyn that's doing a Guitar Hero night. Can I go down and check it out? And they were like, what? That's crazy. And like we went and looked and we were like, wow, people are playing this at this night. And so even like when we were doing GH2, we were far enough along on Guitar Hero 2 that we were doing press. And we had this like big press day. And we had like 4 outlets there. You know what I mean? It was like still nobody knew about it yet, you know? So I think it was like basically by the time like Guitar Hero 2 came out, it was still like by then it must have been that we knew it was a big hit. But I think it was GH2 was like the big hit that we were aware of. You know what I mean? Because it was faster. The first one was so slow. It kind of took over culture. And then by the second one, we were like, oh, okay, this is like an instant hit. Does anybody?
We were like, I mean, at that early phase, we were very much still caring about like if our local Best Buy had a copy of Guitar Hero on the shelf, you know, like, or were they hiding it? Did you have to ask for it? And was it in the back? Like, it was pretty late into, I feel like even GH2, if I'm remembering correctly, for anything to really hit. And so that was a pretty long burn. I feel like the biggest jump was like Rock Band era when we just became a music game making machine and we went up to hundreds of people in the studio.
And that
other than that, yeah, pretty slow.
Rock Band 1 and 2, right? The huge jump.
What was that?
Yeah, it was. It was because that was when I got there.
Yeah. Because it was still, I remember Rock Band, the first Rock Band, it was still a very small studio.
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed really big compared to what it was before, but it was still small. And then there was like all of a sudden, you know, basically exactly what you're asking, was it fast or slow? The big jump happened between Rock Band and Rock Band 2. And then it was like, you know, what's described in the oral history where you were sort of looking around being like, I don't know any of these people. Like we have people all the time who were like, oh yeah, I worked at Harmonix. And I'm like, you did? I don't remember you.
Just in terms of when you sort of in the article, you know, it sounds like in the early days of Harmonix, and the early days I'm using loosely here. It's a long period before the studio kind of blows up, but the studio worked on a lot of different music games, and there was exploration of a lot of different design spaces. And I am curious when suddenly that you were the Guitar Hero and then the Rock Band studio. I am curious, like, did that come with certain inhibition at all? Like that suddenly there were more eyes on you, more expectation. Did it sort of change? Because it sounds like the studio was so experimental for so long in ways that were rewarding and maybe frustrating. But I am curious how that sort of rush of success and having your studio now defined by this one project, does that change things on the inside, or does it, or do things mostly stay the same in terms of your creative process?
I think that from what I recall, the cycles were similar for GH as they were for Rock Band, where at the start and during GH1, Rock Band 1, they felt just like Amplitude and Frequency and first Karaoke Revolution. It's like fun experimental territory. And then, you know, whenever a game developer gets to do a sequel, even the first sequel can be really, really rewarding and fun in a slightly different way, where it's about putting in the things that you didn't get to get in the first one, you know, and, you know, you have a little confirmation that people dig what you're making. And so you're emboldened a little bit. And so, you know, I think that only when you start getting into the 3s and the 4s and the 5s and such, that's where attitudes start to shift a little bit. For me personally, I felt like Harmonix was really good at staying kind of like peppy and like into the work that they were making. The big hit for me was when we became MTV, an MTV company. That's when I felt like there was a certain pressure on us that was really different than we had ever experienced from just a simple publisher relationship. We had great relationships with our publishers, actually. Like after having done this now for a few decades, it's kind of mind-blowing how good our relationships were for the most part. But then the MTV thing is when I felt like the pressure changed, the kind of work we were doing changed. A lot of us, like even on this call, we were now, flying or taking trains around to go to meetings that had actually nothing to do with video game making. It was like clothing, merchandising, and board meetings and stuff like that. And that's when things really shifted, I think.
There was definitely, for me, I mean, there was a sense of like suddenly being part of a machine that I didn't understand. And like, I remember things like, certainly I was being like flown around to places and like staying in hotels like I could never have afforded. Like we weren't like making money from it, you know what I mean? Like, or I wasn't. So it was very weird. And I remember things like PR professionals from MTV being like, okay, let's go over your talking points. And I was like, what's happening? Like this, I just go and say whatever and it's always cool. And it's like, no, there's things we want you to accomplish. Like, and certainly things like when we did the Rock Band announce at E3, that whole experience was like super weird for me, where it was like, there were people that were like, well, instead of wearing a red bandana, how about green for Microsoft? And I was like, oh my God, like it was just a very strange experience to be kind of suddenly a sort of spokesperson. We all became these like official spokesperson people for this thing. And then I don't know, that experience for me was really strange. It was fun, but also weird.
I didn't get that. Could you try?
Perfect.
Yeah, your phone wants you to say that again, Helen.
Did you say something disparaging about MTV?
Yeah. They're always listening.
Eric, I'm curious about what your experience of all of that was, and whether did the series remain interesting to you, or did it become kind of a solved problem for you because you'd laid down so many of the rules for how this should be done and how it should feel? I am curious, if iteration was as interesting to you as creation in this phase.
Yeah, I mean, there was some of both. Like Ryan said, sometimes when you do a sequel, you get to do all the stuff that you didn't have time for the first time, so that's kind of cool. We weren't quite like Madden 25 or anything like that. So I think that we were trying to push things with each release, especially as we got into the Rock Band 3 was a big push, over Rock Band 2, for example, is for trying to do things differently. But I do like trying to solve the problems. That's a big part of why I like working here. Trying to do all that kind of stuff. But so I don't see that much of a difference between the creation or problem solving. We certainly weren't on a treadmill to try to just pump out 2 more babies every year or something like that. So I think I think the biggest problems were like other people said, when you get success, the pressure is just like giant. Your teams, your 25-person team or whatever who worked on Guitar Hero 1 is now a 75-person team, and you're trying to organize all that and for Rock Band 3 or something, and so everything just feels way different, but I think that's just the way it goes with anything. It's like your second album in a band is always has a lot of pressure, right? And so it's the same. It's a very similar thing, I think.
I'm curious, what direction did the pressure come from? Because I think around this time, or at least a few years after, one of the things that games media started talking about is like we all learned that like there were Metacritic expectations on studios. Can you believe it? Your reviews can affect how much a studio gets paid. And so there is an awareness that like suddenly studios were under these metrics coming from publishers, oftentimes kind of divorced, sometimes from like sales performance, which was a weird thing in itself. I'm sorry, my dog
Has some thoughts.
she knows that when I'm talking into the glowing rectangle, she can basically extract concessions. But yeah, so like I'm curious, did the pressure tend to center on you need to deliver a hit, it needs to move this number of units, or was it a we just want to see gains in Metacritic, or is it just the scale of operations that all of this is on your shoulders? I'm curious where you guys felt the most pressure when you're sort of approaching your jobs.
I felt for me personally, it was more like just internal. Like there, obviously, you knew that video game companies normal. I mean, we were lucky. We had a couple hits where the company was sort of making money, or at least had a guarantee that they were going to do more work. And most video game companies live, like from game to game. They ship a game. They don't know for 2 months later if they're going to make another game or not. So I think there was there was some kind of worry about that, but we had a lot of, I think there was a lot of internal pressure just to try to sort of stay true. And as we were getting larger, try not to forget the things, the way of working, or the things we loved about working when you were smaller, So I felt like pressure that way. And yeah, when we were with Viacom, that's a big corporation who had their own set of rules that, they made Helen wear green stuff instead of whatever stuff she wanted to wear, stuff like that. But
yeah, I mean, similarly, I was like pretty naive at that time about, it was sort of like, I just thought all the games we made were going to be hits and were going to be awesome, but I mean, and now I feel like much more pressure now to like, okay, is this gonna be a thing people like? Is it going to be cool? But at that time, it just in that heyday, it just sort of felt like, yeah, I don't know, we make games, they're cool. But I remember specific things like when we were doing the Beatles Rock Band, there was like a ton of like internal pressure that we were putting mostly on ourselves, just because it's like, oh God, it's the Beatles game. Like we cannot fuck that up. Like we have to do a really beautiful, it has to be like the most beautiful game ever, and it has to like really represent the band, and we can't get anything wrong, and like every amp must be accurate and every guitar must be perfect. And there was nobody was like ever like sitting back and being like, well, let's just pump out another hit. It always felt like it always felt the same level of intensity to me the entire time like I've worked there, basically.
Mm-hmm. I think the Beatles, I mean, that's interesting that you bring that up, Helen. Like the Beatles I do feel like was unique in that way. We always had put internal pressure on ourselves of, just doing great work, but also, especially if the game we were making was close to our hearts in some way. So if you were into the kind of music and the lifestyle of Guitar Hero, like that, that put personal pressure on you. If you were into the Beatles, same thing. And the Beatles it was like, it's so hard to explain what it felt like, but it was so, we were so in awe of the band. And it was so global, even across people who were classic rock or heavy metal or punk or whatever. It's just like when you suddenly are making a game for the Beatles, it's a completely different thing. And while we did have people like Yoko Ono come to the studio, I wouldn't even say that was the high pressure points. It was just like every day absorbing information about the band. What were the little nuances of the characters? Of the band members' faces, so we could put them on the characters. Like every little thing about that band we loved and we wanted to represent, and we felt like in a way we were writing the history book on the Beatles in a way, because that is how the game played out, from start to finish. And just the impact it had on the studio, I felt like was really unique compared to the rest of the games. But again, not unique in that it was really internal, like a lot of internal pressure on ourselves.
But it definitely felt like it was the most important game we had ever done, and would ever do, right? Because it was, maybe if we had done the Led Zeppelin game, that would have been a rival, but we didn't.
Yeah.
I was going to say, like, prior to that, like the closest thing that you could probably compare to that would have been like doing that AC/DC track pack, which was really just about convincing a bunch of old men that no one was going to steal their music when that disc came out. Whereas with the Beatles, there was such a hands-on approach and such a desire to do right by them that I think it was just such a different approach and such a different vibe from the other games, where it was really just about, we got these cool songs, check them out.
Yeah,
if we'd done a full AC/DC game, I think we would have felt a similar.
Maybe, yeah.
Like the Beatles, it's such a thing of reverence in music. It's like a little bit, and with the Beatles that there are going to be fans that are so hardcore that they're like that. There's like 5 pixels wrong on the amp or whatever, So.
Right. Well, it also, if a bunch of us would go out to Abbey Road and we'd be there for a while, and they live that every single day, and they kind of know it's their job to know their importance in the world of music and culture. And so when you are kind of stewing in that for a little bit and sitting in Studio One or whatever, and coming home and trying to relay that to your team, like where the magic is and all of that, it's just sort of surreal.
Yeah, it was interesting that the people who hold all the Beatles rights, Paul McCartney and Ringo and Olivia and whatever, they were all involved. They all had to approve artwork and character, especially the characters, and right, like Ryan said, we had to do all of the sort of mixing and preparation that we normally do in our studio at Abbey Road, because they didn't want anything to leave Abbey Road. And so we did, like, I went, 4 or 5 times, something like that, 3 or 4 times. And we mixed with Giles Martin, George Martin's son, and they just wanted to be involved. They were excited about it, and they wanted to do a good job. And that put a little bit of pressure, like, boy, the entire world wants us to do a good job right now, so we better,
Well, also remember, I'm pretty sure the Beatles were not available digitally at that point.
No.
You had to have them on record, CD, tape. There was no MP3s of Beatles yet, no streaming of Beatles.
I forgot that. That's crazy.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that I wanted to ask. Like, all of that sounds. What was the balance of fun versus terror, I guess, is maybe it's the wrong word, but at the same time, like, we're talking about pressure, and there's like the normal pressure of like being at a studio, working on creative projects, but like I can't fathom working on something like Beatles Rock Band, where you do have this expectation and this care expected of you, and you are being, as you said, Ryan, like sort of steeped in that history. I am curious, like, was it mostly, I'm mostly just curious, how much particular pressure was there just knowing that you were working on a Beatles project, and like the people who are sort of safeguarding that legacy all have their like eyes laser focused on you?
I mean, every day was different, and I feel like if Josh were here, who was creatively running that game, he might have different answers, because I think every department got hit slightly differently. For me, it was like a real roller coaster. There was a thrill of hanging out in England and in the studios, and getting to talk about famous guitars that you've seen on TV over and over, and recreating them, and working on the Beatles members' faces and stuff like that. But then there would come the like feedback where they would hate like Beatles and wives of Beatles would hate the way that we were representing them, and we thought they were perfectly good. So it could be, for me in the art department, it could come down pretty heavy. I think when I flew out there to show them, I think we had George drawn first, and a couple like early models, and it went okay, but it was like, it wasn't great. And then as we kept working with them more and more, they just got really intensely involved, which I 100% appreciate and feel like had a lot to do with the beauty that became that game. I don't think we could have done it without them. But it was like a new kind of like roller coaster ride for me as like in the art department.
Yeah,
it was.
So go ahead, Eric.
No, I was just going to say, we didn't have quite the critical. I mean, the good thing about the audio part of it is that we had Giles Martin on our side, and he was kind of making sure everything sounded good from that part. So he got to interface with the stakeholders, and so we didn't feel the same direct pressure that the art department did. So I think for most of the people in the audio department who were working on it, I think it was like 90% fun and 10%, pressure. Other than, it was really excitement that people had to do a good job. And there we had some people there who were like super Beatles nerds forever, and they really got into like all the nuances about every little thing, and it was exciting for people.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, overall, a great time, I thought. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, from my perspective, as someone whose job was primarily on the promotion side of things, it was never not imparted upon us that this was a big deal. This was going to be a big deal. This was an important thing that we were doing, and that like we needed to treat it with a certain level of weight and care when getting out there and showing it and talking to people about it. But it was never in a way that felt menacing. Like, like no one's jobs were being threatened if someone did not, the bill didn't work the right way or anything like that. It was very much like, just, give it the weight it deserves. And, the one thing I will say from our perspective, that was maybe the easiest game to show in the world, because you don't have to really sell it that hard. You say, we got the damn Beatles songs, and look at this art that we made around it and this game that we built around it. And, even when you were showing it to like executives at like Destination PlayStation at a, some awful resort in Scottsdale, Arizona, where all these people are doing is wandering around into rooms and seeing games and going, yeah, I guess we'll buy that. They were like, you could see some of them kind of melting while they were watching it and just being like, oh man, this is awesome. And that was the thing about the game, is that like a game like that could very easily have just been a pretty but ultimately dull museum piece for what the Beatles is, but it was always fun. Like the game always felt fun. The songs were always fun to play. Like once the harmony stuff started getting in there, you really kind of saw like where you could go with it. And I think that just from the perspective of someone who had to show people that game and sell it to them, it was maybe the easiest job I've ever had.
So obviously this is like, that's an extraordinary case for like working with bands and such, but one of the things that Blake really gets into is that when Guitar Hero 1 is happening, nobody knows what this is. Nobody in the music industry really understands what it is you're making. Nobody knows what is being asked. There are a lot of new tracks being laid down by session musicians to sort of create the right audio landscape for the player to sort of play along with. I am curious, how much does that change once people realize, oh, like Guitar Hero, Rock Band, we know what those are. My industry now cares intensely about these things. Like both in terms of what you have access to, how does that change? But then also, does it impinge on your freedom at all as you begin working more? Like you're no longer dealing with total neglect from the music industry. I'm curious how that changes the experience.
There's definitely, I mean, it's so funny. I often forget, like I had that experience today of reading the history of like, oh yeah, Wave Group. I forgot that like it's some of them are sound alikes, or you know what I mean, like that it's not all, you know, original masters that we had from the very beginning. And you know, and that was a lot of what we did with like the karaoke games and stuff, is like reviewing, like, you know, giving feedback on these wave group tracks and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. That's been an amazing like arc to see how like music licensing has changed over the years. And you know, you think about a game like Fuser, where our licenses now have to say like, okay, we want to use your song, but we want to like chop it up and mix it with all these other songs, and like fans will just like do whatever with it. And like I don't think anybody would have done that, you know, 15 years ago.
No,
And,
I mean, they specifically said they wouldn't give us their songs because they were afraid of that. I
yeah,
remember.
Nobody at that time, I mean, that was still at the time, nobody bounced out stems for anything. That was not, you know, the separate pieces of the instruments. They were all just, no, what happens in the recording studio is magic, and you get the stereo magic, and nobody else gets to see behind the curtain. So part of it was obviously that the licensing troubles were trying to convince labels and artists that this is not going to make your band look stupid. And then there was no way that even the ones who were signed on were like, we're not giving you these secret files. And we're like, okay. So we went out and we had them made, you know. And I remember some people, I remember as things got bigger, I remember having, you know, arguing or talking with the people from like the producer from Rush, and they're saying, well, we had to use sound alikes for a couple Rush songs, and then a year later, after things were successful, they're like, how come you didn't ask us for the masters? We would have happily given that to you. I'm like, well, we really did ask, and you said no. And then we ended up getting all the masters after, but it took them that while to figure out that A, we weren't going to like ship them all over the internet so everyone can have them, and B, we were going to still treat the music with respect, which is, I think, what they really kind of wanted, you know.
Yeah, that's another thing that's crazy. Like some of my fondest memories, like one of my best memories of Harmonix was one time, like I think on Rock Band, you, Eric, you probably don't remember this. Like you just like pulled me. I was like in the hallway, and you were like, "Hey, come here. I want you to listen to something." And you put headphones on me, and it was just the isolated stems of Brad Delp singing, I think Foreplay Long Time, but it was just like some Boston song. And I was like, it was like a religious moment, because like I just hearing vocals that perfect, like isolated on their own in like studio headphones. I was like, I can't believe I'm listening to this. And now, like today, it's easier to get to hear stems or like pieces of things isolated. But like at that time, it was like, I had no way to ever hear this if I didn't work here. Or like, even like I got to hear I got to hear Chinese Democracy before like almost anyone in the world. And like, that was a very weird honor.
I think Guitar Hero and Rock Band sort of like were instrumental in getting most of the labels to start creating stems, because nobody did that before. They would occasionally bounce out their Top of the Pops version, you know, with just the background vocals or whatever, or their acapellas and stuff, but nobody did that. And because of the success of the success, and then the saturation of these music games, all the labels got routinely used to like bouncing out stems because they knew it. They knew they had to have it. So it's kind of a weird thing that I think that games like Guitar Hero and Rock Band started, you know, and affected the music industry, you know.
I am kind of curious, how much of this was just stemming from like vestigial piracy panic from like the late 90s and early 2000s? Like how much does that loom large in every conversation you're having with the labels? How much, like what did you need to reassure them about, you know, when it comes to being allowed access to those materials?
We had to jump through a lot of hoops sometimes. I mean, we when we started getting real like stems, you know, broken out parts of all these songs, we put them, and we still do, we put them on a secure server that only, at that time, there was only a couple people in the company that, you know, had access to it. And obviously when we when they're in the game, they're heavily encrypted, and I think even for when we did the Beatles, they were like encrypted like 35 million times over with all this crazy stuff. But we had to, we had to assure them that we were doing the right thing. And they weren't really afraid of piracy. They were really oddly hung up on having their pieces show up in odd remixes. They didn't want their stuff munged together with other stuff, and someone puts out a new record, that uses the vocals to this song and that, whatever. So
there were a few bands that were very particular about the piracy thing, if I remember. I joked about the AC/DC thing, but I remember being told in very hushed tones, yeah, we can't ever let them think that these songs are being downloaded in any way, because they are they're not on iTunes, they're not anywhere, they don't want their music available digitally anywhere. We have to reassure, I don't know if this is 100% the reason it was done as a disc, but my understanding was part of the discussion around that track pack becoming a disc was to assuage their fears.
And it's also one of the reasons that they didn't give us studio versions. They were all live versions,
People are mentioning it in the comments in the chat, and it's a natural segue. I thought might as well just ask about it now. We're talking about stems. We're talking about like sort of reservations around sampling. How much did that conversation change when you're making something like Fuser now? Like in terms of viability, it sort of seems like now you were kind of making the exact thing that would have terrified the hell out of these people like 15 years ago.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was pointing out. Yeah. Is like, it's crazy now that artists are like, yeah, sure, no problem. There's an enormous amount of work that goes on the music licensing side, and I think that is a sort of like secret Harmonix magic thing that a lot of people aren't aware of. Like, is just how experienced our music licensing folks are and how much work that is. So, when people look at soundtracks, sometimes they're like, where's this? And it's like, it's not like we didn't think of those big artists. You know what I mean? It's like, it's hard to license music, but it's gotten from what I've seen on the periphery, like artists are increasingly chill about licensing and increasingly excited about it. I don't know how much is like, how much things like Spotify have an impact on that, where there's just the notion that people might have access to your music in different ways and for free, and that people all around the world might just like chop it up and do whatever they want with it. It's just like, that's something that like people in many ways would want. It helps make their music better known. And, there have been many artists who have broken not by the original track, but by some weird remixed version.
And I think that our licensing people work really hard, and they struggle to get tracks also. But some of that comes from, with every game, as we're trying to push further, we're asking for wider and wider rights, right? So like early on, we were just saying, no, we're just going to play your song as is, and that'll be good, and everyone will love it. And now it's like, well, we're asking for all those things that we want to do. And so every time we do a game that says, well, we want to ask you to do this, and we want to let customers mash it up and make a video and post it. What do you think about that? And so that keeps it, while they are getting much looser to the idea of handing out this stuff, as we keep on asking for more rights, I think that it's like an equilibrium a little bit,
Yeah. I mean, there's also, the reality is, like, back then, whenever that stuff was released digitally, like, they had to keep careful hold of it, because that stuff could spiral off into, piracy realm. I think in the last decade did not have the access to stuff that they did beforehand, but now that stuff's everywhere. And, we live in a post-Neil Cicierega world where everyone has heard someone mash up the Friends theme with Disturbed. And, like, this is an avenue for artists to have that stuff go viral and, get out there, but they still get paid for it, which I think they are probably very amenable to.
Yeah, I remember for a long time, we had to be careful not to accidentally make a feature that you could call, quote, a jukebox. Mm-hmm. So on all of our early games, we'd have to be careful that you couldn't just leave the controller and suddenly you were streaming people's music for free. Thinking about how things are now, like you guys were saying, with streaming services, things are so different. But man, like I don't remember if it was Amplitude or Guitar Hero where at the last minute we had to take out a mode that I think actually was kind of like a jukebox. You know, you could make a playlist and listen to your favorite songs from the game. But we had to freak out and pull that out super last minute because it was a no-no.
Yep.
We did that a lot of times. We kept making that mistake. I still have a lot of like warm feelings towards artists who licensed to us early too. I don't know if you guys have that, but it's like a lot of the artists, especially from Guitar Hero 1, who were just like, yeah, that sounds cool. Here you go. Like I still like if I hear them on the radio, I'm like, aw, those are cool.
In terms of, so one of the defining features of there being Rock Band and competing with Guitar Hero, like it's weird when I think back how much discourse was taken up comparing track lists for games and track lists for upcoming releases. Like this is one of those things where I'm figuring out if I want to get into this industry in some ways, and I'm like, man, it seems like a big part of this job is just like copying really like set lists from these two games and turning them into a blog. I don't know if that's for me. But like I'm curious, like, was there a behind the scenes booking war of sorts happening between the two franchises, or did you run in such separate directions that there wasn't a ton of like, oh, we need to, you know, get this and make sure that, you know, Guitar Hero doesn't have it or vice versa? Like, was there, you know, in Blake's piece, obviously, a lot of people feel that the rivalry was sometimes overstated, but also in terms of the value proposition being made to customers at the time, often centered on, here are the acts you'll be able to play. Here's what you'll be able to listen to and sort of inhabit. I'm curious if there was sort of a behind the scenes competition to see who could land what and how that would play out.
I think, yes, there was. I mean, it didn't affect most of the artists. Like there was a lot of sharing between Activision and Harmonix, but every once in a while, if someone got, you know, a hard to get artist and they did a big thing for them, you know, put out a whole game or put out a whole bunch of stuff, there was some level of exclusivity built into that deal so that, you know, the competitors can't do the same thing. So there was some, you know, for the dozen top bands that everyone has a trouble getting, if someone landed one of them, we're like, ah, shit, they got them and we can't get them, you know. There was a little bit of that, but it didn't affect, you know, 80% of the stuff that we were doing, I think.
Yeah, I remember Activision kind of having the first shots fired in that particular war with the Aerosmith game and sort of locking up that stuff, which just as an outsider looking in always felt like a little bit of a specific middle finger toward Harmonix because Aerosmith, you know, Boston band, kind of part of that whole scene. And then they locked up the Metallica stuff. And around that same time, I think, is when they announced like the AC/DC track pack. There was the Who stuff, the was originally going to be Who's Next and then turned into a greatest hits collection. So like, yeah, like Eric said, there was a certain amount of exclusivity, I think, built into some of that stuff. But like you said, most artists were just like, yeah, you want to work with us? Cool. Yeah, let's do it. Like it really didn't seem to matter who was making it as long as like they were getting the promotion they wanted.
Right.
So in the middle of this, in the middle of this craze, really, well, I guess there's a question right there. This blew up so quickly that you had a major part of the games industry spring up in terms of the history of games, like almost overnight. And I am curious, for those of you working on the inside of it, did the thought occur that this might be a bubble, that like this might be a fad that will pass? Was that an anxiety? What was there a little more confidence in the legs of this concept? I'm curious what the feeling was as this went from being like a cool new experiment to being one of the major genres of the industry for a number of years. Like, how much discussion was there internally of like, how sustainable is this? How long can it last?
I do remember there being a lot of, I mean, we were, from my perspective, like I was always like I said, like pretty like naive or just like not interested in like the money side, because like we had that luxury at the time that it was just like, oh, is it a hit? Cool. Like I just like wasn't that aware of, and I certainly wasn't aware at that time of like things going on in the studio or like anxieties that people had. But I know now that there was a fair amount of anxiety. At least I know Alex like predicted basically, he was sort of seeing like, especially how much was being put out, how quickly by all parties. And I do remember him being like, this is too much. This is like too much, too fast. That's all I kind of remember about that.
Yeah, I mean, we were kind of trying to brace ourselves and think of new games that would be in other genres that might be, finding their success post the era of rock and roll, because we certainly surfed or caused or got lucky by, or however you want to look at it, the wave of rock and roll's like comeback. But before that, rock and roll's kind of dead, and probably was going to be again. It happens. It happens in waves, and so we would be thinking about what can we do? Electronica, hip hop, dance culture. What can we do to prepare ourselves for the inevitable? Like Helen was saying. And so there was always that on our minds. I mean, you can kind of separate what Harmonix does in like one camp. Or in that era at least, there was like rock and roll, and then there's also music games. And I personally wish that we currently lived in a world where the music genre was still as gigantic as it was then. Whether it's rock and roll or not, like, sure, I wish every game was a heavy metal game. Like, that's just what I want. But like, man, I just do not want to see another game where you're like an army dude running around killing people. Like, if only that space could be occupied by music, like, it would be so much better. But like, for a while we went with what we knew, and we were doing rock and roll, and then it was really interesting to think about the future, and if things were going to collapse, like what comes next, and who do we have in the studio that would love that and be good at that and forge new teams based on that expertise and knowledge.
Now, one of the other things that comes up in Blake's article is that to a degree, we do know that market contracted, that the wave did crest and then subside a bit. But part of the story is, we remember it now, is that there were a lot of music games coming out at a pretty astonishing clip. Like, it went from numbered sequels to there being, massive DLCs and sort of expand-alones happening. But when you tallied it all up, it became a space that was very hard to track as a consumer, and there was just a lot of it. And I guess the other part of this is, do you think there's an alternate development of this where that doesn't happen, where people are not grabbing with both hands and trying to take advantage of this, and like that music space stays vital and sustainable, and there's continue, creating within it? Or do you think it was kind of always destined to have its moment and then subside a bit? Like, how much does the arms race that happened between Rock Band and Guitar Hero, how much does that basically seal the destiny of the entire genre?
I mean, if I felt like the destiny was sealed, I'd probably work somewhere else. I mean, I probably wouldn't, because I really like making music games, but it's like, no, I still think there's so much space left, and when the issue is oversaturation in a short amount of time, that can be solved by time, like Ryan said, it's cyclical, and especially interest in things like rock and roll, like it just can come back and surge. So like, I do think that there's the potential here, and we've seen like huge hit music games, not just big games that we made as a studio, but like it was like Beat Saber and other games that were like huge. So I think we might have extended the runway on that particular kind of music game longer if there had been fewer things coming out, but it might have just been a sort of like cyclical shift in the passions for that very specific thing. I mean, we still, for what it's worth, like Rock Band 4 still has like an enormous amount of daily players, like enormous, and that came out like 6 years ago. So there's still a lot of folks who are like really love the genre and are still with us, which is awesome. That was a sort of a PR-y answer, but
I would agree, though. It seems like this, the saturation, all that kind of stuff didn't crush every style of music game. I think it crushed this particular music game, that style, this rhythm actions thing that we were doing, because it got hyper saturated, and after a while, you're just like, okay, even if it wasn't, you just like, after a while, you're like, after several years of the same thing, you're like, okay, I'm going to try something new now, and I think that's what it was, So I think we just spent a lot of time working on Fuser, our kind of big, thing. So we're excited about that, and we're excited to keep that thing going. So I don't think we think that the music genre, people are always going to want music games of some sort. I just think that direction that we had, years ago, it peaked, and once something's at the top for a long time, people will start going, okay, I want to change.
I am just curious. You mentioned like daily concurrence playing Rock Band these days. I'm just curious. Did those numbers change at all with everyone moving into quarantine? It occurs to me that I could see that being a thing people get back into around about now. And I'm just curious if there was a trend you're able to observe in this last year.
There were more people playing in 2020 than we anticipated, which we feel weird about.
I was one of them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad that people were able to like enjoy this thing from home again. But yeah, it certainly seems like there was an effect.
Yeah. So one of the other questions I had was in terms of, and this is going back a little bit, but Harmonix has made a lot of. I've been playing fast and loose with the music genre term in some ways, because like, and you just sort of called me out there, where like there's a lot of different music games, and I'm kind of curious, like, how much does all that experience in creating these early music games, frequency, amplitude, creating dance games, how much of that all starts feeding back into the next project, right? Like how much of a continuity of like concept and experience exists as you work through these different forms of music game, different interpretations of what that can be. How much does that become a building block for the next project, right? Like, do these things like live on at all when you're conceptualizing a project like Fuser, or is every design kind of its own thing? It's just a totally different approach to the space. Thank you, Mina.
I would say there's a lot of building on, even if it's not as directly as we're not doing exact, something that's the same thing. You learn, we learn so many lessons just about UI and timing and things like that, and in the Guitar Hero and Rock Band games that we use now, even if they don't show themselves in the same way. We learn. We learn a lot about like difficulty curves and stuff like that. That was a giant deal in Guitar Hero. I remember we would, early on in Guitar Hero, we'd play two notes together, and everyone in the whole company said, no one's ever going to be able to do that. You got to simplify it. And within a week later, people were like going crazy and playing stuff we had never dreamed about. But so I think that there's plenty of lessons that we take just from a knowledge bank. And then obviously, we've been working on, we have a kind of an evolved engine that we use. We used to use our own graphics engine. Now we're using Unreal for most of our things, but we have our own audio engine. That's stuff that's just been built on over the years. And so I think there's a lot that we carry over as we move forward.
One of the things that you mentioned in the piece, Ryan, is that you did sort of like, one of the awesome things about Harmonix is that like music is just in the air at Harmonix, and so it's a very musical studio. But you also sort of remarked that you learned later that a lot of people almost like self-selected themselves out of considering Harmonix as an option, because like the studio had a reputation of like, oh, that's where the musician game developers all go. And you know, Eric, to sort of lead off, you mentioned that you hadn't, as into music as you are, you weren't sitting there in Boston being like, I must get a job at the music studio. I must be part of what's going on at Harmonix. And so I'm curious, in terms of that aspect of it, what is the trade-off, or what are the advantages and disadvantages of, on the one hand, having that strong identity of like, hey, a lot of us are into music, we sort of share this frame of reference, and then where does it become a problem that, you know, the expectation that a lot of people have is that before you can even get in the door, you kind of have to fit this mold?
Well, I mean, I'm not there anymore, so I'll give the you know, the historical answer from my point of view, which was, we were already in a weird spot where Boston area is not the hotspot for video game development. So trying to find experienced game creators was really hard, especially back then. You know, now every major city has like a really nice, even indie community, but back then it was very difficult to hire. And so on top of that, and we had to be careful not to like fly anyone out from California during the winter months because it was so miserable in Boston, you know, when they're used to such pleasant winters. But then I would find out, in fact, like you were saying, that later on I'd be talking with game developers who wanted to work at the studio and just never applied because they don't play guitar or they don't play drums or whatever it might be. They were not musicians. So I think it probably had an effect on us in a way that we will never know, because they didn't come to us. So we don't know how many there were. Maybe it was less than I think, but I have a feeling it was probably more than we know. People that we missed out on because of this perception that we had.
Do we often have a weird, like Ryan says, it's kind of a thing we're not even totally aware of, where, you know, Ryan, you were at the studio for what, like 18 years, right? Like so many people are there most of their life, you know, like just an enormous amount of time. And like, I've never worked anywhere besides Harmonix. I mean, I've had jobs outside of Harmonix, but I've never like worked in any other office or game studio. And there are a lot of other people like that who are still at the studio who've like never worked anywhere else. And so we only know like the way we do things, and and it's been useful over the past few years, especially where we have brought in a lot of different people with different experience, and we often learn like, oh wait, is that not how other studios solve X, Y, and Z? So that, I feel like that can be one of the downsides, in as much as it's also still awesome that they have all these people that have all this, long-term held knowledge of all the history of the games and just like a lot of passion about music. But there are a lot of people there that I would say, you know, it's hard for me to imagine like doing something else, because I like being around musicians. Like I like talking to people who are passionate about music. And that's like something special that the studio has. But I do, you know, it's less, I don't know, cliquey is like not the right word, but there certainly was a period where from the outside, especially, it looked like, oh, everybody who works there is in a band. And there was a period where it was like, yeah, it was like an enormous number of people were musicians, but it shifted over time, and it shifts back. And I do think now we have a much broader range of like different kinds of musicians and a broader range of different kind of backgrounds within the game industry. It's like for a little while there, it was really like, it was very rock and roll. It was like rock, metal, punk people mostly. Yeah. Now it's like much broader.
Yeah, I think there's another side of that though, which is that I think there was also an appeal to that. And I will say that a big part of the reason I wanted to go work at Harmonix was specifically because I caught that vibe, like just even, not just from the games themselves, but also just from like being around a few people at the studio and meeting them and just kind of like talking to them. They didn't talk like game developers. They talked like people I knew from my shitty little local punk scene who, had kind of been through the ringer in a similar way that I had been. And that to me was enormously appealing. Like when I decided to leave GameSpot, I didn't apply to any other game studios because game development was never necessarily like the path of my life that I saw myself going down in any way. But there was just such I don't know, like, kindred spirit feels like a hokey way of saying it, but like there was just something there that I latched onto and I felt like of a piece with that I wanted to be a part of.
I think when we were small, when we were 50 or 60 people, it sort of made a lot of sense that 45 out of 60 people were actively involved in music in some way. It doesn't make sense when you're 150 people, or it's hard to keep, that's when it, I think, started doing us not more harm, but you start to suffer because you need to get people in who, like Ryan said, they either won't do it or they didn't think of doing it because they thought of something. But back when it was like a small group of people, I think there was a lot of good benefit to it,
So something else I had just wondered is that when I think about when people in my circle started to fall off music games in general, one of the drivers of that was people started moving from Rock Band to playing with real instruments and getting into, like, I don't want to say real music, but you know what I mean, right? Like actually playing an instrument and actually like getting into a real band. And that's anecdotal. Like I have no idea a Rock Band player into an actual like real live guitarist.
We do hear just like an enormous amount of those stories. So it's like, again, anecdotal, but it seems like a lot of people had that experience.
Well, there was a point where and I don't remember it, but there was a point where we had data on things like Fender would tell us how many more guitars they were selling this year compared to the year before. And it was just based on Rock Band. And I don't know the number anymore, but they, as a company, they were aware of the impact that the game was having on humans buying guitars.
I never heard that. That's awesome.
Yeah. Similar stories with bands, like when like Black Sabbath would call us and tell us how their sales are skyrocketing or something like that. There were ways that we could somehow glean information from other sources. But when you're inside, you kind of you can't really tell who's doing what.
Yeah, whenever someone, posted something, a note or something saying, hey, I used to play this game a lot, Guitar Hero or Rock Band, and I went out for the first time and I bought myself a Fender Squier guitar. That's like, wow, you graduated, That was always the most exciting thing to hear, because that's sort of been Harmonix mission a little bit into develop an appreciation or at least feeling of performing an inspiration like that to people who don't normally have that. And if they can move into the thing of actually trying to do it for real, like you said, that's an exciting thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I remember how much like there were certain areas where there was like all this preciousness that luckily there isn't today, and at least not in the same way. One was like around soundtrack, where it was sort of like, that's not rock, that can't go in this, that. And now, like, luckily now it's like, we've definitely expanded that, where it's like, I give in the analogy of like, you go into a record store, you expect that there's going to be things that you don't like in the record store. You just like, don't buy them. It's like, it's fine. You don't have to like everything in every soundtrack or in everything that's available for DLC, but like, we want you to, have enough of the things that you like. And luckily that's gone. But the other thing was like especially when Guitar Hero came out and was becoming a hit, do you remember how much there was this like, why don't you just buy a real instrument? Like, why are you playing these fake plastic buttons? And it's like, it doesn't have to be one or the other. And I think we all were gratified to see, because like it's not like we wanted people to just play the simulation version either. We wanted to give non-musicians the joy of making music without having to learn to make music, and then inspire them to actually play real instruments, which did happen. And it's weird now because we're seeing it's far enough out from some of those games that it's like you are seeing a generation of like adult musicians who many of them were inspired or started playing because of those games. And we hear about it every once in a while. It's like some band that we're all super into, and it's like, oh, that drummer got started in Rock Band, and you're like, so crazy.
Yeah, I remember when we used to take the game around, like one of our jobs was to like go and do these like bar nights and other sort of like event things where we would show up and we would set up the game and people would come and play. And we'd hear a lot of that, like, oh man, that's not a real instrument. Why would you even bother? But like over time, that kind of like, oh yeah, no, I used to play this with my family all the time at Christmas, and you know, now my cousin wants a drum set, so I would apologize to that person immediately, you know, as soon as they said yeah, they want drum lessons. You know, it was a real shift, and it was a pretty quick one too, I feel like, you know, because once people got a taste, because the thing Rock Band always did really well was it captured the spirit of performing in front of people. Even if you were just in the living room with the other, you know, the people you were playing with, it always managed to get that spirit right. And I think once people got a taste of that, they started to realize that like, oh, this is something I actually want to do, even if not like full time, just like a fun hobby, just to, you know, to learn this instrument that I've always been interested in.
Yeah, I think Rock Band had a different reception than Guitar Hero did in that way. Like, just because it was about being in a band and being social, it was played totally differently. And you would now go to parties and clubs and, like you were saying, all different spaces where people were doing it recreationally. Guitar Hero, even though it was like goofy and silly in a lot of ways, it was kind of hardcore in other ways. And so it was, you know, it was like you looking at your guitar, looking at your TV playing guitar. Rock Band was about going to a party and watching 4 other people playing that game and then waiting your turn to get in, kind of thing. And I feel like that changed people's perception of these games, and it wasn't really that chip on the shoulder about just go play a real guitar thing anymore.
I think a lot of that chip came from real musicians who were feeling threatened or something. I mean, I admit that I had that when I first came, you know, I was like, do I want to make this game? Yes, about rock music, that's cool, but we're going to make plastic guitars. You know, and I had that kind of like, okay, I'll give it a whirl, but I wasn't totally excited about it until, you know, the game started to come together, you know. I was also one of those snobs a little bit, you know.
When it comes to that, the question of, you know, the music games Harmonix has made have touched on a lot of experience and relationships with music, but I'm curious, what is an experience or relationship that you think like you've evoked particularly well, like in terms of like, oh, we totally captured the essence of this is such a decent encapsulation of the experience of doing of playing this or doing this. I'm curious like what your highlights are in terms of the high watermarks for what you've achieved.
For me, I mean, I think, you know, I have limited experience with touring, but I've done some, and you know, I've done the like rinky-dink touring in a van around places that you can drive to for a few weeks thing. There were people like, you know, Jason Kendall, who were, you know, had an experience of like touring and playing like these huge shows and festivals and Warped Tours and stuff like that, and like did that for a job, or like Bryn later through Bank of Marrow, like it's just like doing that for a job. And that was a thing that in my experience of touring matches the experience that we represented in the game at the low level. And I think some other folks who had, you know, like Eric too, you know, who were like on, you know, like talk shows and stuff like that. Like, I hope that we got the fancier levels right too. But I think that sort of like, for me, that really the scrappy, like dirty, but like passionate experience of like just being in a band and touring, and some of the like jokes we did around that, or like, you know, like that stuff I'm like particularly proud of. A lot of that because I worked on text, and I wanted it to be like funny and.
Yeah, I don't know if this exactly answers the question, but I have seen all sorts of things related to those games. But one of the ones that, for whatever reason, sticks out to me is I was at a party, and there were a lot of people there, and we were playing Rock Band. It was brand new, so we were like there were a couple of us that had made it, and we were kind of, we were proud of it, and we were showing it off to people. Everyone was having an incredible time in a way that I had never seen from Guitar Hero, which was much more competitive. Like, am I better than you at Guitar Hero? And we were playing, and Paul, who was in my band at the time as the bass player, who also did artwork for the story that is being run right now, he grabbed the microphone, and we were singing. We were playing an Iron Maiden song, and Paul lost his shit singing to Iron Maiden. Like, I had never heard him even speak loudly. He was a very toned down guy, and then there he was, like, perfectly singing this song, screaming it loudly and hitting every note, and like the room was sort of on fire. And I watched someone who was and it was just like getting the whole room amped up as if we were actually on stage. So seeing like a close friend and a room transform over the course of like 1.5 minutes playing a video game was something that was just like the lines between being in a band and pretending to be in a band kind of like blurred out at that moment.
Yeah, I think I had a smaller but similar experience just in, I think, the first Guitar Hero game, where I was still like unsure of how good this thing was. And I remember just, I think we were testing out Symphony of Destruction or something, and just like playing it in the little office that we were, and had it cranked up and just playing them, and then forgetting what I was doing, and sort of like, not paying attention and feeling like I was actually really, really, really playing the song. And then it sort of clicked for me, and I was like, oh, this shit works. This is it just works, and because I bought into the illusion that I know all the secrets of, but I bought into it anyway and fell for it. And I'm like, oh, people are going to love this, because I had that feeling,
Yeah, I think that's really what the best Harmonix games have done for me, and have generally done for people who play them, is that they let you lose yourself kind of in the experience, the musical experience that they are trying to convey. I think it's something that's equally effective in the Dance Central series. Like the way that stuff is conveyed through the movement and the music is, it's really easy to lose yourself in the experience and not get overly self-conscious about it once you kind of have a little experience with it. And in the case of Fuser, like, that's a game that lets you destroy music in so many different fun, bizarre ways. And it's really easy to kind of lose yourself in the experience. One, because the tech works in a way that it seems like it should not. And two, because it's just inherently fun to annihilate music and create musical crimes the way that game is designed to do. And I think that, that's just kind of been a hallmark of the studio over the years.
Musical crimes. That'll be our new catchphrase.
Time for crime.
I think the musical crimes of Harmonix is probably a great wrap this discussion. We can look forward to many more, hopefully over the years. But thanks so much for joining us for this discussion, and for participating in this article that Blake wrote, which, to people who joined the site, just as a reminder, there is a long and very intensive oral history with a number of people at Red Octane and Harmonix at the time around the beginning of Guitar Hero 1. It's a long read. I'm not, like, when the draft came in, it took me 2 days to go through it all, I think. So it might be a week read, but it is a damn good read, and we're also going to be talking to the writer on that, Blake Hester, Waypoint Radio, on the episode that comes on Friday. And then if you missed parts of this stream, obviously there'll be the Twitch archive, and eventually it'll make it onto the Waypoint YouTube as soon as it goes through our Rube Goldbergian production pipeline to a YouTube release. But Helen, Ryan, Alex, Eric, thank you so much for spending your evening with us and going back down through memory lane.
It was so much fun. Thank you.
Thank you
for having me.